It seems odd to claim that Twilight was marketed wrong, but the reality is that the publisher, rather than Meyer, decided who the book would be marketed to. An occurrence that's more common than you'd think. For my part, I've heard of authors being told to age their characters down, otherwise keeping the story the same so as to appeal to that younger audience, and there have been suggestions that YA writers had to edit aspects of their books, including simplifying certain portions or lessening potentially edgier content in order not to offend the intended market. However, I don't think this was the case with Twilight. In fact, Meyer wrote exactly the story she wanted to. She just didn't write it for teenagers. Bella was always a high school student, and Edward was always physically 17. But if Meyer's publishers did influence her, it was simply to extend her story. When Meyer first conceived of the saga, it was going to be a duology, with Bella becoming pregnant as early as the second book. Now, Twilight isn't the only YA series to have its characters grow up to have children. Both The Hunger Games and Harry Potter show our protagonists beginning families of their own. But in the case of those series, several years elapsed. The young heroes likely waited until their 20s to become parents, while Bella literally becomes a mother at the age of 18. Unusual for a YA book until you remember that Twilight, despite the age of its protagonist, wasn't written for children at all. While marketed towards a teen demographic, and successfully, I'm here to make the argument that Twilight is actually another genre, and one which could have been marketed very differently. Twilight, based on several elements and tropes within the text, is actually a Gothic romance. If you're unsure what a Gothic book is, examples include Wuthering Heights, a book that's referenced within Twilight, Jane Eyre, and later novels like Rebecca, written by Daphne du Maurier, another female author who shared Stephenie Meyer's admiration of the Bronte sisters. By chance, Twilight has elements which make it suitable to be a YA book as well, including a teen protagonist, attractive male leads, a love triangle, and so on, which is why it did so well. But Twilight is as much a Gothic romance as it is a YA. And while I don't think Meyer set out to write any specific genre, the influence of the Gothic on her work is very clear. Now, in this video, I'll briefly describe what Gothic romance or Gothic horror is, what books Meyer was influenced by, and what elements of Twilight actually make it fit into this category. However, before we dive in, I'm Riley, and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I discuss books and share the occasional writing advice, so if any of that sounds like your cup of blood, hit the subscribe button. Twilight could be classified as a Gothic novel for several reasons. But first, we have to look at the authors which influenced Meyer, and explain what Gothic really means. So, what is a Gothic? In short, a Gothic novel is a mix of genres: romance, horror, thriller, and paranormal, all blended to form one unique tone. Usually not horrifying enough to be classified as horrors, nor wholesome enough to be considered healthy romances, Gothic sits at the edge of all genres. Leading male love interests, for example, may be controversial or abusive by our standards. But while their actions make them unfit to be wholly romantic, their behavior isn't nasty enough to land them in the dark romance category. As for the content itself, there might be creaking stairs, ghosts, or frights, but something like Jane Eyre isn't going to be terrifying in the sense of a Stephen King novel. Instead, Gothic novels are typically spooky, unsettling, and atmospheric. More mood than anything, Gothic novels are ambiguous. Even their classification under the labels of fantasy or paranormal aren't cut and dry, as many will start out as seemingly supernatural, only for rational causes to be attributed to the strange occurrences later, though the unusual events in themselves are what make the novel Gothic, regardless of their origins. Certainly, a Gothic novel can be literally paranormal, with Dracula and Frankenstein being classic examples, but novels like Jane Eyre are instead written like fantasies while still being dramas. Mr. Rochester's first wife moves about the house like a ghost. Jane Eyre returns to Rochester because she hears him calling her from a great distance, and Jane herself is described as being like a fairy, though Rochester doesn't mean this literally. Jane Eyre is firmly planted in the real world, but it's written in the style of fantasy, and small events like Jane being able to hear from a great distance hint at the supernatural. Wuthering Heights is even more ambiguous, as while the story is primarily focused on real-world events, there's the implication that Catherine's ghost is haunting Heathcliff. Hearing all this, it might seem like a Gothic novel is impossible to classify, but if we look at many of the Gothic classics, including the works of Anne Radcliffe, considered to be the pioneer of the genre, we'll find there are several recurring tropes within the genre, which can be found within Twilight. Of course, the biggest argument that Twilight is a Gothic romance comes from the books Meyer was influenced by. She wasn't influenced wholly by Gothic literature, as she also enjoyed Jane Austen and Shakespeare, shaping the book into a romance and a fantasy respectively. But among her heroes, we have the Bronte sisters. Twilight does share elements with Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, but the book which is referenced directly within the text is Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Meyer makes no secret of her love for Wuthering Heights, or its influence on her work, as Wuthering Heights is one of Bella's favorite books too, and a point of conversation between Bella and Edward. In fact, Bella and Edward compare themselves to Catherine and Heathcliff respectively. In reading the book to better understand Bella's enjoyment of it, Edward can't help identifying with Heathcliff, pausing, ironically enough, on a passage where Heathcliff talks about drinking blood. When it comes to how Heathcliff behaves towards Catherine's husband, Edgar, this is reflected in Edward's treatment of Jacob, as both characters resist the urge to kill their rivals, if only so they don't hurt the woman they love. As for Bella, she questions if she's like Catherine, if she's someone selfish enough who would hurt others, if it would mean she could have her own way, and, more importantly to her, assure Edward has his. When it comes to the Cullens' preparations for the battle against Victoria's newborns, Jasper notes that they could increase their strength if they drank human blood, and Bella is chilled to realize that she would accept Edward doing this, literally killing a human being, if it would improve his chances of survival. People have accused the Twilight saga and its leads of being both problematic and toxic, which isn't surprising if Bella and Edward are based off of one of the most controversial couples in literature. People have the same debates over Heathcliff and Catherine, noting how unhealthy the relationship is. And many don't like to consider Wuthering Heights a romance at all, or at least not a healthy one. Twilight gets scrutinized even more though, because it's marketed to a teen audience, whereas Wuthering Heights is firmly a Gothic book, fitting within a genre where dysfunctional relationships are kind of the point. Had Twilight been picked up by a different publishing company and pushed towards readers who enjoyed Daphne du Maurier or Shirley Jackson, its reception might have been different. This isn't to say it wouldn't have had its controversies, but stacked against Rebecca rather than Harry Potter, it might have been viewed in a different context, for better or for worse. It's certainly a novel that could go either way, and it still works as a YA. But I want to point out that Twilight, based on the tropes which comprise the work, could have been just as easily classified as a Gothic, and here's why. If we break the Gothic novel down to its brass tacks, we come up with at least 8 tropes which are inherent to the genre. One book doesn't have to have all of them, but if a book has most of them, it's probably a Gothic romance, and Twilight incidentally has all of these. First, you have the Byronic love interest. Edward has more in common with Gothic male leads like Rochester, Heathcliff, and Maxim de Winter than he does with Peeta Mellark. All of these Gothic love interests share the same traits. They're moody, even cynical and mistrustful. They're domineering or emotionally closed off. They're driven in part by guilt and self-loathing. They're wealthy, and they often have a dark secret, with murder being the most extreme. Heathcliff is an anti-hero, gaining his wealth and prosperity through underhanded means. Cantankerous and cruel, his only redeeming feature is his love for Catherine, though even that's toxic. As for Rebecca's Maxim, well, I don't want to spoil anything, though it's enough to say he has a checkered past. Rochester doesn't commit murder, but he does lie to and manipulate Jane. He loves her, but conceals from her the fact he's keeping his first wife in the attic, even going so far as attempting to marry Jane despite being legally tied to Bertha. Edward likewise can be brusque with Bella. Many readers have pointed out that he's controlling, manipulative, and prone to lying to Bella. What's more, he has a shadowy past. Though he's a vegetarian now, he has tasted human blood. He is a murderer. Taking all this together, Edward acts like the quintessential Gothic male lead. But that's only the beginning. Bella's actions also make her a Gothic heroine. Bringing me to 2 more reasons Twilight is a Gothic novel. In the earliest Gothic hits, it was a standard for the female lead to be captured by some wicked man entrapped in a dreary castle. In other words, your early Gothic leads were damsels in distress, a label that's been applied to Bella. Taken by some horrifying villain, the heroine would then be rescued by a dashing male hero. In Bella's case, she's first captured by James, only for Edward to swoop in, defeating not only James, but removing the venom from Bella's system. Bella even admits within the novel to a temptation to throw herself in harm's way, just to keep Edward close. What's more, these damsels in distress were usually overly emotional, given to lengthy inner monologues, fainting fits, and no shortage of tears. These ladies are always on the edge of a mental breakdown. I've said in previous videos that Bella exhibited symptoms of anxiety and depression. Prone to panic attacks, anxiousness, and worrying, Bella fits this bill. I mean, we're talking about a girl who flings herself off a cliff to hear Edward's voice. She goes into catatonia, almost faints, and throws up when she hears Victoria is after her. Yet there's another theme Bella gives us, which makes Twilight a Gothic novel, and that's chastity. Even in the edgiest Gothic novels, the heroines are pure. Though pressured by dastardly men, they hold their chins up and fight to keep their virginity. No matter the temptation, they remain paragons of virtue. And Twilight taps into this idea. Bella doesn't sleep with Edward until they're married, as Edward wants to keep her virtue intact. We see this same theme in Jane Eyre, with Jane choosing to run away rather than become the mistress of a married man. Unless she can be lawfully wed to Rochester, Jane won't taint herself by sleeping with him, which will inevitably happen if she remains. In Twilight, it is Edward who leaves for a time, because he knows staying will tempt him, but it's the same idea. Moving on from the characters, another element which makes Twilight a Gothic novel is its setting, Gothic books always have a moody atmosphere, and a part of that comes down to the location where the story takes place. Overcast days, mist, and shadows create a distinct mood, and Forks is as dreary as you can get. The Collins home admittedly subverts this trope, as their home is light and open. When Bella expresses surprise at this in the film, Edward jokingly asks if she was expecting coffins, dungeons, and moats, all staples of the earliest Gothic settings. What Twilight does have, besides a dark, wet town, is another Gothic trope, a creepy castle. Bella doesn't spend the majority of the plot in Arrow's Volterra stronghold, but as with any Gothic novel, there's the threat that she or Alice might someday be imprisoned there, or that they will die within its walls. Certainly, the castle is Gothic on its own. It has a series of chilly subterranean tunnels. It's ancient, and people are regularly murdered within its walls. Arrow's home would fit perfectly into something like Anne Radcliffe's Count of Udolpho. On a more obvious note, the fact that Twilight features vampires also makes it Gothic, as one of the staples of the genre is the supernatural, whether it's suggested or literal. Dracula is one of the most famous Gothic works of all time, and the supernatural threat within it is very real. Frankenstein likewise features a very real monster. However, how the monsters, real or imaginary, are presented is also what makes a book Gothic. And Twilight, like Dracula, makes the discovery of Edward's condition a mystery, exhibiting bizarre behavior, showcasing unnatural abilities, and revealing strange physical characteristics. Edward, like Dracula, becomes suspect in Bella's eyes. Like Van Helsing, she knows there's something different about him. Twilight's ending offers happiness to its monsters, a subversion of the old trope. But the road to reveal them in the first place is similar. Like Dr. Frankenstein, Dracula, or Carmilla, Edward begins as secretive. He conceals from Bella what he is, leaving her to piece everything together. And he is at times frightening. Like Carmilla, his actions are downright bizarre sometimes, though not so out of the way that they can't be rationalized away. Again, Edward gets a much happier ending than Carmilla or Dracula, but his whole quest to keep his secret, to pretend he's human, and to fool those humans he's closest to is the same. Finally, coming to the 8th similarity, you have the writing style. Twilight doesn't have the best prose in the world, but half the problem could be attributed to its genre confusion. For example, some of the critiques leveled against Twilight include its use of big adjectives, overly long descriptions of scenery, and its slower pace, all common elements in Gothic novels. When it comes to the mother of Gothic fiction, Anne Radcliffe, the biggest complaint modern readers have is the fact that she spends paragraphs describing trees, fields, and more trees. For Bella's part, we have primordial firs and the tidal pools, descriptions in themselves which aren't bad, but which some could accuse of slowing the plot down. Meyer is also charged with using strange words like chagrin, or of overdoing it on the adjectives. But other writers, such as Anne Rice and Angela Carter, also writing in the Gothic genre, face the same charges. The fact is, Twilight's execution of such a style could have been better, as descriptions from Radcliffe, Rice, or Carter can be quite lyrical or beautiful, if purple prose is to your taste. But for those like myself who appreciate such a style, Twilight's prose, if not great, is less glaring if viewed through this lens. If Meyer was spending a lot of time reading about Wuthering Winds, it makes sense that she'd be a little verbose, as Twilight, like many Gothic books, is also slower paced, spending more time on tree descriptions than action sequences. Altogether, Twilight shares 8 tropes with the Gothic genre as a whole, qualifying it, in my opinion, for the genre. And while some of these tropes haven't aged as well, it's interesting to view Twilight in another context, particularly since Meyer, writing for fun, didn't initially intend it for the YA category. As far as sales went, placing Twilight in the YA category was probably for the best, as the Gothic genre can be quite niche. But on an analytical level, classifying Twilight as a Gothic helps to explain much of what average YA readers otherwise find odd about it. With its love triangles, shirtless shifter boys, and teen leads, Twilight is very much a YA book. But it wasn't intentionally written to be one, and based on Meyer's influences and the tropes within the text itself, it is just as much, if not more so, a book belonging to the Gothic genre. With more in common with Wuthering Heights than Harry Potter, Twilight is one of the most famous Gothic novels, despite not being classified as such. From its themes of chastity and its slow pace, to its moody forests and emotional damsel in distress, Twilight checks off all the boxes, allowing us to view the story through a new lens. Some will still find the story regressive, given that debates over Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights continue, and certain tropes haven't aged well, even directly within the Gothic genre. However, Gothic literature can't be wholly praised or blamed for shaping Twilight into a book that's dated for some and entertaining for others. If the book comes across as old-fashioned, that's because it was influenced by a number of the classics. In addition to Wuthering Heights, other famous pieces of literature inspired Meyer, and in the video on the left, I list them, along with how they shape the story. As always, thanks for watching and happy reading.